Pediatric Speech Sisters show. I'm so excited to have our guest today. We have Ruchi Kapila. They are a speech language pathologist. I'm going to go ahead and read their bio and then we can get into the episode. So, Ruchi Kapila is an NCVS trained vocalist. You're going to have to break that down for me after this bio. Thank you so much. They're non-binary, neurodivergent, and Punjabi-American. They are owner and sole proprietor of Kapila Voice and Speech Services on unceded Muwekma.
Yep, Muwekma.
Muwekma, thank you so much. Alone land in Hayward, California.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Providing voice and communication services with a gender inclusive lens as a speech language pathologist and singing voice specialist. Kapila also teaches singing voice in their private studio. They frequently present and educate on gender-affirming voice care and intersectional cultural responsiveness within the SLP field. She also serves as a founding member of Trans Voice Initiative and research role member of the newly formed Disability Caucus, a multicultural constituency group. I brought them on the show to discuss gender-affirming care, neurodivergence, intersectionality, and overall just cultivating a space where everyone can feel inclusive. I'm so sorry, y'all, not to make you jealous, but we got to have a little talk right before we went live, which really could have been its own podcast, but I'm just so excited for everyone watching this and watching the replay to learn from Kapila. Is there anything that I missed in your bio that you'd like to talk about with the audience?
No, I think we're great. I will say that I recently started on the Speech Science podcast as a co-host, which is something that I need to obviously work into bio. And yeah, I mean that covers a lot of my history and background. Happy to expound on that. Yeah, and feel free to call me Ruchi. No formality for sure. No, it's okay. I feel like it's very a British formal school, and I'm into it too because it feels like I'm a detective or like Kapila is on the scene. And I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, I was like, I feel legitimate.
That's really what I was going for.
Yeah. I was like, you brought me on for a whole meal, which is wonderful too. I'm into it. So yeah, it's thank you so much for having me, Melanie. It's been great.
Thank you for coming on and really just your patience with the production and everything. I do want to touch on where you're currently serving. So I definitely butchered the land. It's Muwekma.
Yeah, Muwekma Ohlone land.
Okay, Can you tell us about that?
I am in the process of learning more about indigenous land acknowledgement. I don't feel like, transparently speaking, that I've gotten to make the connection as much as I would like to in order to acknowledge this region in the Bay Area. And I make an effort to do so whenever I present and bring people's attention and awareness to the fact that we are all impacted by colonization. We are all impacted by white supremacy. We are all impacted by patriarchy. We're all impacted by capitalism. Just to keep the show light in the beginning, obviously.
You could be as controversial as you need.
Yeah. So, and I think there's also, from indigenous and native communities, there's an understanding that just saying it is not enough to really acknowledge that you've made a connection with these communities and these people. And I think it's also an invitation to be curious about where you are, the history of the land that you're on, and that, we all have different connections to where we come from, and one of the things that we talked about in the pre-talk a little bit, not to get on a tangent because I will get on them very easily, is that we talked a little bit about me spending time in India or going to Punjab, and I have a complicated history and connection to where I come from, and that can only be even more frayed when land is just taken. and not shared. And that's something to always keep in mind. So I think that might be part of the reason I share where the practice is, even if it's in virtual space, basically.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
thank you for your transparency with that. One question that's coming to mind is, how do you plan on making that connection as a member of that new space?
Um, I think it's one of those things of reaching out and on people's time, making donations, making time to learn, which, honestly, as a neurodivergent person, that can be hard to trace all of the things that you're trying to learn. And I think that's a, a, com- a complaint and a concern that a lot of people in the majority in our profession have is, how do you do this? And I think it's just like, you understand that you have human limitation and you're always trying and striving to have understanding and awareness. Um, I I think it's about having consciousness and carving out the space in your mind as you engage with work, engage with empathy and understanding, and that you kind of start to transform that perspective in yourself, and you start to have conversations with other people and start to hold boundaries around certain things. Like, that's kind of how I see making that kind of space. Um, Being able to plant seeds with other folks as you learn about things.
Mm.
Um,
Yes, and thank you for sharing that. I know myself, I'm from Oklahoma, so I moved back to Oklahoma, which is indigenous land, and I'm about to have a placement out in Locust Grove, which is predominantly white and Native American. And
wow.
so, yeah, so even though I am born and raised in the space, I grew up in the city. So there's going to be a whole new learning curve that I'll get to have, which is exciting for me. At the same time, I think that there's always that kind of fear, like, oh, I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to go in there blindsided. So right now I'm in a space of doing as much learning as I can, but just like how you said, I'm neurodivergent. So I'm working on my capacity to learn it all, but
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is embracing that it's messy. I mean, there's always mess. There's not a really neat and tidy or easy or comfortable way to navigate this stuff. So I commend you in doing that work and committing yourself to that growth. And I hope we get to have more conversations about it.
yeah. Oh yeah, trust me, we will.
Yeah.
Um, so let me get into you and why you started your practice. I mean, you're already doing amazing things.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
Specifically as far as gender inclusiveness, voice, all the things that you're doing, even how you've been able to move into the podcast space.
Yeah. I it's honestly really humbling. I think me coming out, whether it's with regard to neurodivergence, which, to be transparent, a lot of that is through community self-diagnosis, and it's a work in progress as it is, in terms of recognizing how that impacts me in my daily life. But also coming out about being non-binary, queer, like, these are things that kind of um jumped out, like, maybe during and post grad school for me later in life. I think the podcast space, and kind of being in a more public arena, kind of came out because of pandemic, and being doing more teletherapy based things, from having been in an acute inpatient hospital setting for a long time, an acute rehab background as well. I wanted to have, my first podcasting journey was with Hindsight Project, which I did with my friend, Asher Marin, and then we just interviewed Black and brown, like, trans and non-binary and generally queer folks that we knew, because I just felt like they had wonderful stories and perspectives to share during that time, and that was during 2020. So um, I have questions for myself about, I think those conversations were great. Sometimes I wonder if I was the best person to have them. Um, and whether I was more two-dimensional in terms of my perspectives around what does it mean to elevate people and what does it mean to share their stories. I think there are probably things that I would have maybe handled differently in terms of getting people with their, handles out, making sure that they're getting reimbursed for their labor and stuff. That wasn't something that I really had much access to or awareness around at that time. Or I didn't really have the financial capability at that time to be able to provide that. But it was a wonderful learning experience to get to connect with people, to learn about my ability to do audio editing. Clearly, I had a great love around sharing these stories in the most high fidelity way possible, and I took a lot of pride in that. And so it was wonderful to be able to, especially as a person who is neurodivergent, like somewhat finish a project and have something that I was, really proud of in terms of perspectives to share. In terms of being in the podcasting space, now it's wonderful to be on Speech Science. Matt Hott is one of the people who helped me in the beginning, uncharged to learn about how to edit podcasts, and how to get started, and was really passionate about bringing somebody else into the space. And so I'm grateful to be able to share the mic in a way with him, and be in that group of people and get to have these types of conversations about things that affect us in the field. So yeah, did that kind of get at what you were going for? Is there anything I missed? Because it's so easy for me to miss things.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much, honestly, for opening the door and letting us into your world. There is one question that came up for me. I'm thinking about, I have some loved ones who are in graduate school. And so there's a lot of imposter syndrome. I'm sure some people might be listening to this and have imposter syndrome around choosing or even accepting their identity. So maybe from going from binary to non-binary, or going from neurotypical to neurodivergent. One story that's coming into my head specifically is I have a friend who doesn't want to claim being neurodivergent or having ADHD, because she's just like, well, I don't have an official diagnosis. So I don't want to be that person who says I have ADHD if I don't have ADHD, or having those ADHD symptoms. So what advice could you give them?
My advice, because I wrestled with, masking so heavily, especially during my early career and when I was in graduate school, probably throughout my life, and especially, this is the stereotype also about being South Asian, there was like pressure. Sorry, mom and dad, if you watch this, there was pressure around like high achievement, fulfilling a role in your family system, fulfilling a role that was expected for you in terms of academic success, and career path, all of that stuff. And it what I don't think anybody meant to cause harm, but like that takes a toll. And I think paying attention to fatigue. When do you feel overwhelmed? What are the things that really stress you? Does your, like, we're going to get a little bit, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a mental health practitioner. I do counseling only in the scope of our field, right? With regard to voice modification, that sort of thing. But do you have voices that pop up that say, hey, like, you should be able to do this? Or like, does the source of motivation come from shame around, like, why can't I do this? Like, those are telling. That kind of coding that we have around, this is something you should be able to withstand, this is something you should be able to do, versus being like, I can't, and being able to own the voice of I can't. Whether there is a formal diagnosis or not a formal diagnosis around that, I think paying attention to what our motivators are of, like, do I feel comfortable putting up a boundary? Do I feel comfortable saying no? Do I have tools that are available to me to advocate for things that I need? Do I feel safe doing that? All of those things are things to pay attention to. And while I feel like different labels, whether it's the umbrella neurodivergence label or specific ones when it comes to being autistic, ADHD, all the other particular examples of neurodivergence that you can think of, are helpful in terms of community connection, can be helpful in terms of getting the supports that you need through, a medical system. Your mileage may vary depending on who you are, right? But I think just being curious around, I feel impacted in these ways. This is a real thing for me. We live in a situation where being productive and making money or product for other people is very tied to our value, and making a decision about whether like you're going to internalize that piece or that you're an organic being that has changes from day to day and what your needs are is like really, really important to investigate. So, I mean, I think getting beyond label and just thinking about functionality of like, this impacts me, that's a real thing. I need to be curious about that and wonder what's going to make me feel either validated or feel like I have more sustainability in my life, or feel like I'm generally happier, or I feel like I can accept myself in terms of my human limitations. Those are like the directions I would go in with regard to whether somebody is battling with like, why is this different, and am I trying to conform to something that doesn't fit me?
Thank you so much for that perspective. We do have a few people on. So those watching, please feel free to drop comments in the chat or to ask any questions that may come up for you, and we'll answer them throughout this conversation. So Ruchi, you did talk a little bit about acceptance, and I want to pivot into the intersectionality conversation. So
Sure.
My first question is, how would you describe intersectionality?
I think it's all of the things that you inherit and all of the things that are given to you and how that impacts your life. I think that goes to, DNA, family systems, um, mental and physical health related considerations, cultural backgrounds, language, obviously, what body you're in. What are your general strengths and challenges? What system are you working through, and how does that system describe you, and what are the things that are advantages or barriers for you as a result? It's everything. I mean, one of the things that whenever I presented on intersectionality for a credit institute, that I came up with was that I think we have models that are very strongly structured around. I think everybody's seen like examples of like a wheel or interlocking circles of different aspects of things. But I really do think intersectionality works more like paint mixing, that we have different levels of advantage or disadvantage throughout our lives. In ways as children we may not be able to advocate for ourselves as well as if we were adults. People may listen to us more dependent on a level of education that we might not have had before. So there is flexibility in terms of intersectionality and how that plays into power and privilege, that I want people to be aware of as they talk about these things. I still sometimes am puzzled at ways that I've experienced disenfranchisement despite having so many resources from an early age too. And that's just a really confusing and muddled thing that I think about on a daily basis as well, in terms of how I move through the world. So, I mean, that's the nicest way I can talk about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, and if I can share, just pretty much piggybacking off of that, I would say that I was relatively privileged, came from a middle class household, had great education. But then it was when I graduated, I'm like, oh, wait a second. I forget that the color of my skin offends people, or the way I present myself offends people. I forget that could actually affects me in the opportunities that I get. I actually just forget. I actually have to remind myself of that. So I appreciate you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and with regard to how it impacts, my career, I think it was more of like I had to make a decision about whether I was going to say or do things for other people's comfort or to uphold systems, because that's a choice I suppose I could have. I think that's how I figured out it was neurodivergence, in case you have other people who question that about myself, is that you have a physical rejection sometimes of this is how things are. You should just do this thing, and this is how you'll be successful and people will like you. And then you'll ascend in things, and maybe you'll do or have to say things or ignore things that really bother you, but that's okay, right? Because you have to look out for you. There is an inherent physical rejection of that for me. And I think that really impacted me when it came to intersectional considerations in the field. I had to wrestle with, I'm not someone who wants to, especially this iteration of me is not a person, who necessarily wants to pick fights or argue or get into controversy. But I am also pretty much unafraid of talking about things from my perspective or speaking things plainly. And I think one of the most telling things amongst SLP colleagues were like, you are the type of person to say the thing that everybody's thinking but won't say.
Oh, wow.
And, it's a gift. It's a challenge. It's probably not going to get me elected to office anytime soon, but
I'd vote for you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That means a lot.
I would.
We'll have a tiny party, pediatric speech sister party.
Oh, please.
Yeah. So I don't know if that kind of this is the thing. You're catching me live in a neurodivergent moment of like, what were we talking about? Did I talk about? You talked about imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Okay. When it comes to imposter syndrome, I still deal with it. I still talk to my husband, my spouse, about like, I don't know if I'm this thing, and I feel like the next thing that I do publicly is going to be the thing that exposes me as like a fraud, instead of it being like, we're human and we're always in a process of learning and change. I want to invite people to recognize that when they are in these vulnerable spaces, that when people watch you actively learning and challenging yourself, that is inspiration to others to do the same thing instead of hiding, pretending to have knowledge that you don't, trying to keep things looking nice when they aren't nice. It is so inspirational and also a relief to people when they get to see people be human publicly. And while academic institutions may not value that inherently, because, I think a number of people in those institutions may also feel uncomfortable with how much they know in terms of clinical impact, how much they know in terms of all of the students that they have to serve. And there's a need to like keep up appearances around like, we're doing this really well, or we're at the highest standard. That's always changing. But every time that you put yourself up for something, whether it's in graduate studies, whether it's a new job or endeavor that you take on, and it's a learning experience and you're transparent about it, that like really frees other people up to try things, to go I think there's a big story or big thread of liberation in that.
I really like how there's an overarching theme of this conversation about self-acceptance, and the title is Empowering Gender in Neurodiversity. And so I like how you also brought up academia, and I'm not even just thinking about the clients who we're working with. I kind of touched on this before we went live. but not just the clients that we're working with, but also our colleagues and the generations that are coming up behind us. So there's really three levels to this. There's the people who are in charge of teaching the up and coming speech pathologists. There are the speech pathologists who are interacting with our colleagues, not just speech pathologists, but people of other professions. And then there's the clients and the people who we're working with. So if we can generalize it, let's try to generalize it for the sake of time, because I would love to just break each one down. In a general sense, Ruchi, how could we empower people to be them true selves, to be their true selves as far as their gender goes, and empower people to be their true selves as far as their neurodivergence?
Giving people options. I think whenever anybody shares space with you, I'll often talk about things with regard to neurodivergence. I talk about ways that I stim. I talk about things that are personal challenges for me. I talk about things like, hey, you know, when I was doing voice lessons, it was really hard for me to visualize what people were talking about, or when people use metaphorical language to describe what I was supposed to do, I was often puzzled. So what are, you know, things that help you learn? What are things that don't help you learn? What are things that you find distracting, and what are things that you find stimulating? What helps you? Having a conversation around, like, I'm interested in how you work. I'm not interested in posing an idea of how you should work, but working with how things come to you naturally. And giving gentle challenge, of course, and pushback if needed, but, you know, making a space where you can kind of advocate for your needs. And people should ask you these questions when they're engaging with you, especially in super vulnerable work like gender-affirming voice care. And really, I would say any voice care is deeply vulnerable work. With regard to gender, I think making as much space, asking questions in a way that is like sensitive and open-ended. So the way I usually work with a client if they're new is I'll talk to them. Usually I'll have in my intake form spaces for them to talk about, obviously, pronouns, gender identity. I'll talk about, you know, do you have a safe community that supports you? What does this look like? How has your gender journey been? What are you looking for? And then I'll often ask them when we're doing our first evaluation, what's your voice goal today? Doesn't have to be forever, but what pops up in your mind today? How do you want me to describe you in this note if this is something that's going to insurance? What does femme, masc, non-binary, gender fluid mean to you? Can you give me examples of people, visuals, voice samples, things like that? When do you feel the most yourself? What are the things that help you feel the most yourself? I think those are like that's kind of the inquiry that I go down. I mean, and I often have clients wanting me to code their voice, and it's a very complicated situation where I'll just say, you know, more objectively, these are the things that I hear. I can see how people would code that as this. I can also see how they might code it as that. I'm one person, and how we code voices. And there's, you know, I don't have citations for you today, but there is like research that looks into like how specifically cisgender people versus trans and gender nonconforming people listen to and code gender when it comes to voices. It's different, and it can be very highly, you know, subjective and dependent on how somebody grows up and where they're at and all the things that make them them. So being able to make space for like how you feel about your voice, how you feel about how you present, the thing that makes you feel most confident is actually the most important thing. There's also the considerations around safety, right? And that you're wanting to avoid being coded as something if you have to be binary presenting in a way to avoid physical, emotional, mental impact, abuse, that sort of thing. That's something to take into consideration. But first and foremost, finding the place that makes you feel safe, congruent, unified, and that you're like, I can move through the world with this, is usually my primary goal with folks that I work with. And I think that can be applied to anything in our field in terms of communication and connecting with others.
That makes me want to ask if you can give us an example or a story of I'm thinking about counseling when it comes to gender affirming voice. Can you give us a story of how you've been able to successfully do that?
I feel like I get to take some risks that maybe not every clinician can when it comes to that. I talk a lot when I present about meaningful self-disclosure. So I talk about there are times where there are aspects of my voice, for singing voice, that I've wanted to modify, and I felt sense of like powerlessness around that, where it took me a very long time. I try to normalize that voice work is weird, strange, brings out some of the things that feel very vulnerable and scary for us at times. And that while I don't understand exactly the situation a client might be in front of me, I share like, I've been in some shadow realm close to that in my work, in my personal work. And it's okay for us to share that here. I think I always say that there's space for us to talk about nearly anything. I may not be able to do something about all the things that we talk about, and it may be important for us to connect with whoever is the mental health provider, or making an appropriate referral. But I think a lot of counseling is around empowerment, giving people the sense that the struggle is real for voice work. That's just something that's going to happen. And you're going to have these highs. You're also going to have these lows, normalizing that those are things that come up and they don't feel great when they do. And that, you are with somebody who will be transparent about the process and isn't going to sell you on this idea of like self-discovery and modification is happiness and ponies and rainbows and and like, or kind of pseudo Zen spiritualism around it. I definitely work in things with regard to like progressive relaxation, mindfulness, all of those pieces, but understanding that like the things that come up with that aren't necessarily always positive or easy.
Yeah.
But there is space for it, and things are easier usually when we can name things, make space for it. I often tell clients to have a sense of a shelf and say, hey, like we can put this statement, if we have an intrusive thought that comes up as you're modifying, we can put this on the shelf. Mm-hmm. It's okay for it to come up, and it's really about me kind of assessing, hey, do you feel like you can move around that statement? If that thing comes up as we're working, can we be aware that that's there, and also continue to just like push the envelope a little bit or dip the toe in, and like where's the comfort level in that. So it's highly individual, how much you can like encourage folks, but it also gives them opportunities to practice setting boundaries around how comfortable they are moving forward at the session versus what they need, like what's comfortable that day, what's feasible that day. And having the opportunity to have that validated and honored.
I appreciate that client first aspect. Ruchi, before we go, there's something that's just on my mind. I know before we went live, we talked about graduate students who might be ready to leave the field. Especially even when it comes to this topic. So graduate students who are non-binary and also neurodivergent. So if you can speak to that specific person, what would you tell them about getting through this phase, this challenge of their lives?
I would say going through an academic program, you may not be recognized, seen, celebrated for what you're going to bring. But from me, I want to say that you do matter. When you come into the field, it matters to me. It makes it easier for me to continue to do my job and to continue to mentor people and support people and know that we're moving forward. You don't have to do it for me. If you want to leave and there's something else that brings you genuine joy and happiness, please do that. But you being around, whether it's celebrated by the institution or the placement that you work with or your colleagues, you may not get it from them, but the clients, patients, students you work with, future mentoring that you do, it makes a huge difference that you're around. Whether there's a formal award, scholarship, anything that goes along with that, it does matter that you're here. And every single person who doesn't necessarily feel like they are a fit for the field, but have a different lens or perspective, you make the work that we do better and more sensitive and more specific to the people that we work with. You know.
Thank you so much. I just know that touched a lot of people's hearts, like it touched mine. So thank you, Ruchi.
Oh.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience before we go? One question I do always like to ask is if there are any changes that you would like to see done in the field.
Oh, we could be here all day. I want for our field to be more critical about what we're missing, critical about who doesn't get served and those long outcomes as a result when it comes to patients, clients, students that we work with, because I often don't have quick answers to those concerns. And how can you with systems being the way that they are? But being able to consider, like, we do need to recruit based on people who have insights and personal perspectives around who doesn't get served, so that everybody can get a chance at having the services that they deserve and need. So for me, I'm like, it doesn't matter what Supreme Court decisions are made or whatever. This need is going to be in our field, or any helping profession requires these perspectives to be able to build systems that actually serve people and address these barriers. So that's the general thing. That's it sounds like, it does sound like a pageant answer a little bit, but but that's real. And that goes for neurodivergence, queerness, anybody who's an LGBTQIA plus community. We definitely need, I always feel like we'll need more trans folks and gender nonconforming folks doing gender-affirming voice, but also working across our system, whether it's in school-based settings, irrespective of what's happening across the nation. We need that in hospital settings too. We need to have patients feel like they're advocated for. We need more bilingual support. Obviously, there's a shortage of that. So that's something we're always going to need it. And we'll need to be able to empower the voices that come in. And that's also hard for people to yield and make space for that, but it's always going to be necessary.
Well, thank you so much, Ruchi, for that. And everyone else coming in a little late, don't worry. I will be posting the replay. So follow Pediatric Speech Sister for details on that. Ruchi, if anyone wants to reach out to you, ask you any questions and connect, where can they find you?
Yeah, for sure. So you can find me on Instagram at Kapila Voice. It's just Kapila, like my last name, Voice. You can reach me at Ruchi Kapila, SLP@gmail.com. My private practice website, even though I'm working on my more official one, is Kapila Voice and Speech .clientsecure.me. So that's my simple practice website. And yeah, you can reach reach out to me through any of those avenues for sure.
Thank you so much. And I'll be putting
you.
those in the show notes for those listening to the audio version of this. Ruchi, this has been a fabulous conversation, and I hope to have you on again.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for having me, Melanie. It was wonderful chatting with you.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you everyone for coming on. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday. I'm going to be talking to Ebony Green, and she's going to tell us about how to be your own boss, how to get those school contracts, and so much more. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next week.